Today we'll be discussing the Apple TV show Severance, and we'll be discussing memory. This is Doctor versus Comedian. I'm Dr. Asif, and this is the Doctor of Laughs.
Not a real doctor.
Ali Hassan. Every episode I pick a topic for Ali from comedy and entertainment, and I question him about it. Then Ali picks a topic from medicine and health and grills me on that topic. Today, in anticipation of its second season, which just came out, we'll be discussing the hit Apple TV show Severance. Then we'll be discussing all aspects of memory, because of course, Ali, memory and memories ties in pretty well with the concept of the TV show Severance, right?
That's it. I don't remember.
Oh, yes. This is Ali's innie right now.
Hey, it's 2025, dude. Yeah, I'm so scared of memory. It's 2025. I feel like after you say, this is Doctor versus Comedian, we should have some hard guitar licks. Just putting that out there, and the listeners, tell us what you feel about that. Heavy guitar licks after this is Doctor versus Comedian, and more gravitas in your voice. These are the changes I'd like to see for the new year. New year, new you, Asif.
Okay, well, let's see if that happens. Tune in next week to see whether that occurred or not. Spoiler, it doesn't. Okay, let's get started right away talking about Severance. The background for this is Ali watched this show relatively early on when it came out in 2022, I believe. Is that right, Ali?
That is correct. I think I watched it within that first month of it coming out.
And then you told me about it. I just never got around to it, which is so strange that I didn't get around to it.
I mean, it has you written all over it. I told you about it because you are you, not just because I wanted to tell someone about it. I thought this was a show. It lives in this very interesting sci-fi world. It's very smart. It features an actor who you really like. It did have Asif Doja written all over it.
Yeah, I don't know why it took me so long. And then it was the summer of 2023. I was sick off and on for a couple of weeks, just with flu type illness that just kept going on. And so I burned through the series in about 2 days, and I loved it. Yeah, I think I thought, well, we'll get into it when we talk about the production design of the show. I thought it was being a bit too cute and being a bit too weird and abstract, maybe for its own good. Or sometimes shows do that just to be weird and abstract. I don't think this show does that. I think I like the sci-fi concept, but I didn't really know how much of that was into it. So I don't know why it took me so long. And Adam Scott's hair, his haircut in the show is quite unusual. And so maybe that threw me off as well.
Well, there's a reason for that, and I will discuss that to some degree when we talk more about this show.
Okay, well, let's get started talking about the show. So it was created by this guy named Dan Erickson, who's a really interesting guy. He went to Western Washington University, and then...
That is not the interesting part about him.
No. Later went to NYU, and he started doing like theater type writing in his undergrad, and then in his master's he did television writing. And then he did a screenplay for the pilot of Severance, and he was on something called the Blood List, which I don't know what that is. I think it's similar to the Blacklist. The Blacklist is for unproduced screenplays in Hollywood, like feature films. So maybe the Blood List is for TV shows. I'm not sure.
Yeah. In the future, if you don't know what something is, there's something called Google on the internet. You can sort of just type in what it is, and then often it'll tell you what that thing is.
Okay, so in fact, in the 2 seconds where Ali was berating me, it's actually unproduced thriller and horror scripts. So it's not specific to TV.
I'll show you berating. Come on.
Yes, anyway, so that's cool. So things like Bird Box, you guys saw that movie Bird Box on Netflix perhaps? So that was one of these unproduced scripts. So anyway, it was on that list. So he was working on this script when he was working on an office job. And it was so mind-numbing and boring, the office job. He's like, I wish I could just skip 8 hours of the workday and just dissociate. So, someone else goes to work, makes the money, and then I can just relax with my life afterwards. And that was basically the premise of the show.
It's a classic case of what we say in the acting world. Use it. Oh, I missed the bus. I'm so angry. And this happened. Use it. Channel that into the role. He channeled his everyday life into a script, and you love to hear it. I really.
Yeah.
There's also 9 million people who've done that and not had their script find its way to Ben Stiller's hands. And of course, you're skipping some steps there, but yeah, I'm happy it did.
Yeah, so it went to Ben Stiller's production company, and as you said, eventually, as you said, through various steps, got to Ben Stiller's hands. He liked it. He thought it was good. He thought it's kind of making a commentary on the workplace comedy. Listen to an interview with Ben Stiller from The Daily, New York Times podcast, The Daily. And he says he liked it because it was like The Office and Office Space, right? Kind of that commentary, like that TV show and that movie. And he thought it was adding something to that as well. And then in 2017, Ben Stiller, he was on board to produce it. There was a question whether he was going to direct it or not, but he ended up directing the majority of season 1 episodes. Season 2, he does about half of them from what I was looking at from the website for the TV show. So he invited Adam Scott to star. So maybe we could talk a bit about the cast and Adam Scott in particular, who's the star.
Yeah. Why don't we talk about the show concept if anybody doesn't know it and we haven't sold this thing to people. And interestingly, the concept of the show might be an anti-sell for many people in a way, because it doesn't sing with excitement. It's kind of drab. And as you say, you've already suggested, Asif, it's this idea of severing your work person from your outside of work person. Immediately, I found that interesting as far as who would do that, who would need to do that, who would want to do that. Is there not a fear associated with that about what am I doing at work? Right. And in fact, in a dinner conversation early on in this series, that's what happens. They start talking about like, well, doesn't that bother you to not know? And it's like, no, my work sucks. And now I am disconnected with the stuff, part of my life that sucks. Ironically, Adam Scott's outside life also sucks. And his character at work is affable and likable. And he's a little bit like, hey, what's happening? A little bit of jokes and all that. Not much. It's still a very nondescript, expansive, underground workplace with no windows, but they have as much fun as this particular character could. It has echoes of Jim Carrey's Eternal Sunshine of a Spotless Mind. And I think if you like that movie, this is something worth looking into. I do have a confession to make to you, Asif, which is ironically connected to memory. So as we're recording this, the second season, first episode just came out. I'm awake at midnight. I'm like, I'm going to watch it. It just came out. This is fantastic. Before it starts, they do a recap, which because of my poor memory, I require a recap. I'm like, oh yeah, how did this show go again? It's been a while. It's been, over a year and a half. 2 years, I would say, if math serves. I start watching this recap and I realize there's things in this recap that are basically spoilers for me. I'm like, what? That happened? When did this happen? What? I can't. Turns out I did not finish the first season of Severance. I learned that last night during a recap, and I was like, unbelievable. I don't know. I love the act of watching. This is the case, by the way, with at least 15 different shows where I'm like, oh, that show is amazing. And then my wife will be like, we never finished it. I'm like, what? What do you mean we never? Ozark, one of my favorite shows of my life. I couldn't believe how fantastic. I look forward to it with everything I had. It was something my wife and I connected with 100%. Not like, well, I don't really like this. I don't really want to watch it. We just loved it. Our excitement was unbridled. She revealed to me the other day, we never finished Ozark. I'm like, yeah, of course we did. She says, no, don't you remember that last season was a split season? It was like 16 episodes. So they did an 8 and 8, and we never finished. We only watched one episode. I'm like, oh my God. So first of all, I don't remember that we didn't finish it. And second of all, I don't remember, like she remembers exactly where we left it. Anyway, point being, I never finished season 1. So last night, instead of watching the first episode of the second season, I restarted Severance. I watched episode 1 last night.
Oh my gosh, you're so funny.
Yeah, it's so good, by the way.
Okay, so you haven't seen the first episode of the second
I haven't seen the first episode of the second.
I have, but we'll talk about that at the end.
And that's fine. And you have not read the New Yorker article, which I would recommend to people. Just if you're even a half fan of Adam Scott, if you're a half fan of Severance, if you're a half fan of the New Yorker, Rachel Syme, I think it's pronounced, Syme, wrote this article in December. A couple of interesting things stick out. Number one, if I ever do an article with the New Yorker or some such publication, it's important to be on your best behavior, because the way they write these articles, and I'm sure you've seen this, Asif, they do a thing where they go, the star arrives a little late, flustered, but like they pull back, they give you everything. So they didn't do that. He wasn't late. He was great.
What you eat at the restaurant if you're having lunch, yeah.
What you eat, exactly. What choice. He picks through his chicken salad, eschewing the greens for more protein, whatever. Like, it's just, I'm like, I feel this is, what are you doing? That was a private thing.
You gotta set the stage. You gotta set the stage.
You gotta set the stage. So one thing they do here, this particular woman, Rose, says, she meets Adam Scott and he's as nice as you think he is. And she has nothing mean to say about him. And then, and this is not particularly mean, she said, his worry, Adam Scott was the person who's like, I live daily with the fear of anyone thinking that I think I'm great. So it's like this world of like humility and self-deprecation, blah, 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 And then she goes, he talks about last summer when he turned 50, he bought an electric Porsche Taycan. Taycan?
Yeah.
But he worried that it may make him look like this middle-aged cliche. And then in brackets, whether he wanted to show off the car or just his nice guy bona fides, he offered to drive me to my friend's house after lunch. A guy offers to drive you somewhere and you have to link that, the fact that it might be him showing off his new car. I mean, anyway, so that's part of the issue I have with these New Yorker articles sometimes, but it's a great article.
Let's just take an aside here. I was going to ask you this at the beginning, but I wasn't sure if I was going to. It's about interviewing celebrities and famous people because, and I'll link to this article as well, which is in the New York Times. Like I said, it was on the Daily, but you can also find the article kind of written. It's this interview with David Marquez as the writer and the interviewer, and he interviews Ben Stiller, who, like we said, is the director very heavily involved in Severance. So he's interviewing him, and I just want to ask you about this, Ali, because he really challenges him. So Ben Stiller will say something, I don't think this generation is as in tune with being nervous about performing and stuff like that. And the interviewer will be like, no, I completely disagree with you. We'll say it like that. He challenges Ben Stiller almost, I thought it was a bit rude sometimes. Again, I'm listening to the audio podcast, not the written article. What do you think of that? Because you have done long form interviews when you guest hosted on CBC's Q. So
just to be clear, the audio podcast is AI generated, so it's not the actual human being saying it in the tone they would say it?
No, it's almost the opposite. Like the main thing is the audio podcast.
Oh, okay. So you're hearing his tone and everything. You're hearing the guy.
Yeah. You're hearing Ben Stiller respond, and then the article, I think, is written afterwards, yeah?
I think we're not used to that. I think I would also find it, if not rude, borderline rude and a little bit disconcerting. It would take me a little bit out of the interview. And rather than listening to what I want to listen to, which is Ben Stiller's answers, I think I would be a little bit fixated on this guy's tone. That said, we're in this world of like celebrity worship that I disparage often. And we're constantly like, and you've seen those interviews too, especially on the TV stuff, is like laughing, like extra laughing at something that's not really that funny that the celebrity says. And like, oh my God, I know, right? I know, like super hyper agreeing, like you're their pal and truly ingratiating yourself as a host or an interviewer I don't like that either. That also takes me out of things. So why don't we allow an interviewer to have a style? I don't know if this is their axe to grind against Ben Stiller or if this is their style. No, I like challenging people. So if you have that style, any celebrity worth their weight will have a publicist or an agent or, a manager who goes, okay, this person wants an interview. Just to let you know, this is the way this person is. This is how they interview. Are you into it? And then, yeah.
Exactly. And I think the New York Times gets a big pass, right? As you were about to say when I interrupted you. You or I would not.
No, you and I can also make the decision now, knowing the name of that particular article, as you do and I don't just yet, knowing their name, going, oh yeah, this is the guy who challenges. So, okay, I'd be interested to, right? So I just think we're in some growing pains time around this because it's not what we're accustomed to, but a weird part of me welcomes it.
You want that. Okay.
I don't want it. I welcome it. Don't you dare take my words out of context.
Sorry. Okay, let's get back to what we were talking about before. After that aside.
Right. So it's this New Yorker article, and it's actually very interesting. I mean, I'm going to find a way to get this article to you, buddy. It's crazy that you didn't. I think you would enjoy it so much.
Yeah. No, now I was able to find it today, so I'll put it on our
Unbelievable
on our thing. I haven't read it yet, but I'll put it
right
on our.
He talks about his sort of his slog as an actor. And I think this is the interesting thing I wanted to tell you about Adam Scott's hair in this show, which also was a little bit like, borderline off-putting. You're like, Adam, you're better than this. What are you doing? Why do you look like that? But they were trying to create this everyman. They weren't trying to create handsome Adam Scott. And Adam Scott has this interesting thing about his personality. You were a fan of his podcast, so you have listened to just the audio of him. He can speak deadpan about pretty banal things for a long time. And then you think of Party Down, the show where he was the lead as his kid. He can be extremely animated as well, right? He can be very fun-loving. He can also be like, ugh, this is a drag. But he can really excel in the deadpan. But if you remember Parks and Rec, he was like a handsome guy. You were kind of like taken by his looks, and in other films as well. He's sort of this background character, but he's got a good look to him. This is not what this show is. Severance is about creating the everyman, creating the person, like all those people who toil away in anonymity in these, as I said, nondescript offices every day. You kind of want to see yourself in that. You don't want to be seeing a handsome Adam Scott, and I think you don't here, and it's for
and I think that's why he was cast on this, because he can play an everyman, and he can do comedy and drama. And I think that's very important. Now, you have a question here in our Google Doc. When did we first see him? I'm going to guess we both saw him in the same thing at the same time. Yeah. And that would be, let's say it all on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Step Brothers. Okay.
Step Brothers was great. Step Brothers is where I remember him the most. He was the terrible brother of the Step Trip. I have no idea. It's something on IMDb. I'm just joking around.
Was it Step Brothers? I don't know if that's...
No, I had seen him before Step Brothers.
Really? Yeah, okay.
I had seen him before that.
He has a memorable face, but I must admit, Step Brothers, he was still playing a bit of a douche. Like, that was his kind of... So I think he was in things before that, and he was always a bit of a jerk.
Yeah.
And he was that in Step Brothers. And then really Parks and Rec is when I'm like, okay, this guy is more than just this. Though his character at the beginning of Parks and Rec is the serious kind of like no fun guy. And then, of course, we know his character arc through the rest of the series.
Right. Well, okay, so I'll tell you this. If you go through his IMDb, I watched a lot, if not all, of Party of 5.
Yeah, I've probably seen every episode of Party of 5.
I don't know what that says about me, but I watched it all. So he was in 7 episodes of Party of 5, playing Neve Campbell's boyfriend. So guaranteed I saw him. I
don't remember him from that, but he talks about that on his podcast, about being on that show.
I don't remember him, with all due respect. I also watched almost all of 6 Feet Under, except the last season. He's on a couple of episodes of 6 Feet Under. I would have seen him there, right? So these kind of things. And then he was in Monster-in-Law. My wife and I watched Monster-in-Law. She Made Me. So he's in Knocked Up. He's, it's a tangential role, but that was 2007, right? Knocked Up. He plays, some well-established human being in that film has a husband, and he's a husband in the background, I think, right? What else? And then, 2008 was Step Brothers. So Step Brothers, he really stood out as this awful human being. And it reminds me of the way I first saw Bradley Cooper. Do you remember the first time you saw Bradley Cooper and it was in the role of being a jerk?
No, I only remember him from The Hangover.
Oh, you're joking, man. Bradley Cooper was in a movie that I can only assume you saw, which is Wedding Crashers.
Oh, yeah.
He's the guy who doesn't trust these two, and they're playing football together, and all his buddies are like these douche bros who are always high-fiving him about stuff.
I had no idea that was him. So I guess this is your point, is sometimes you don't realize who the actor is, that you've seen him in many things until you go back and think about it. Or look at their IMDb, as you are doing right now.
I am. But to your point, the memorable thing was Step Brothers. And then you go, okay, who is this guy? I want to see more of him.
Yeah. And, just to talk about his podcast, I've mentioned this many times. He did a U2 retrospective with Scott Aukerman from Comedy Bang Bang, and they listened to every U2 album. It's called Are You Talking U2 to Me? Then they did one for REM, and then they did one for Springsteen. Are You Springsteen on My Bean? And it's great. It's so funny. I mean, I laugh out loud. Sometimes I'm driving and I have to pull over because I'm laughing so hard at them. He's a very funny kind of like off-the-cuff improv comedian.
They're very good together, yeah.
They're great together. Scott Aukerman is like a king of improv. It also made me like these bands more. Like, I know I've talked about U2 several times on the podcast, but I really got into them because of that podcast, because it forces you to go back and listen to these albums, the early albums especially, and same with Springsteen. I've always liked Springsteen, but after listening to this and really going in depth with some of his albums, you're like, oh, it's amazing. So,
and some news for you, Asif.
Yes?
There is a forthcoming podcast by these same two guys. It's called You Talking Billy Joel to Me, My E-Hole.
Is it really?
It is.
Oh,
it's in the New Yorker article. They mention it.
So,
I look forward to you walking down the memory lane of all the Billy Joel classics. I think Billy Joel, unless you're like from Jersey, then you never forget about. But I think we forget about him. But he's quite incredible and quite talented.
You know, I was thinking about, we have so many tangents today. I was thinking about Billy Joel the other day, like
What?
the amount of, because my daughter, my younger daughter, she's 13, started listening to Vienna by Billy Joel. I'm like, why are you listening to this? It's on her playlist. And I'm like, this guy, Billy Joel, has so many hits, like so many. You can go to his concert and know every single song. I think it's a good one, and it's perfect for me because I'm not a huge Billy Joel fan, right? Like, and to go back and start at the beginning and go there, I think I'd be really into that. They've done Talking Heads as well. I mean, I must admit, I've never been a big Talking Heads fan. Nobody like, kill me for that, but I should go back and listen to Talking Heads.
If there's somebody who will kill you for that, it's gonna.
It's a big
they're great, but like we don't need to. No one needs to die on that hill. If I can add a tangent to your tangent, Asif.
Yes. Oh boy, tangent.
Did you ever? Does this mean something to you? Somebody, all right. This would be about, I don't know, 25 years ago. It's a cold day outside. They're not wearing a jacket, but everybody else is wearing a jacket. And you go, oh, check out Phil Collins over here. Does that mean anything to you?
No jacket required?
Yes, exactly. Did you ever say that to people? Look at Phil Collins over here when they weren't wearing a jacket?
You're saying your friend just spontaneously came up with that joke?
We would say that for here and there. Somebody came up with that. Yes. Anyway, I thought that was something in more...
No, somebody famous came up with that. None of your dumb friends came up with that.
I think somebody...
That's too funny of a joke.
It's too funny
of a joke.
Yeah. I know. I think it was on some show or in some film. I was hoping you would fill that in. But until you can, I'm going to say one of my buddies came up with that.
This is really a tangent.
They're not all dumb. Some of them. This is a tangent, but my point is Phil Collins also worth going back and listening to.
Oh, yeah.
Like,
this
guy's like, come on, it's fantastic. Okay. All right. Back to this show. The show Severance. Okay. We didn't even discuss it. Basically, this corporation called Lumen Industries, great name. Lumen means light, right? Luminescence. And it is brightly lit in there. It's a biotech corporation. And they use a medical procedure to sever and separate the consciousness of their employees. They implant a chip inside you. That chip is activated when you take the elevator down to the office. You can see this very subtle kind of like shift in their look and like a slight, expansion of the...
Which is, by the way, amazing acting because they don't use special effects, but just when these people go down and change from what they call their outie, their outer world person, to their work person is the innie.
Yes.
They just change their facial expressions. Amazing. Adam Scott does it probably the best, but they're all great at it.
I know, it's such a subtle thing and it's so great. That it's a different person at work. The twists and turns, and it's funny I say twists and turns because the one thing I disliked about this show when it first started were the literal twists and turns of getting out of that elevator and getting into the office. I'm like, just take a walk down a goddamn hallway. Why are you turning this right, left, right? But I think that is metaphors at work, right? This is, and then also...
Well, it's them talking about the idiocy of workplaces, right? Why do you have to take all these? And in fact, the very first scene of the second season involves a lot of hallways. I'll just leave it at that and you'll see what happens. But I think they're purposely making a comment on that. It's very well directed, that scene by Ben Stiller. And yeah, so that's basically it. This is what Ollie's saying. This is the description of it. And what I love about the first season, so there'd be very mild spoilers for the first season, very mild, but if you don't like it, skip to the next section. It's interesting because Adam Scott's the main character, but he's not the main character of the first episode of the first season. It's Helly, this woman who suddenly becomes involved with this Lumen Industries and the Severance program and is trying to figure out what's going on. And he's the person trying to explain to her what happened and to calm down. And so I thought that was very interesting to change the point of view character. They slightly do that in the second season as well. And some of the stuff about how it's the production design of this show, which I alluded to before, is it 70s? Is it 80s? But is it modern? It clearly takes place in like modern times, especially with the sci-fi aspect of the surgery and stuff like that. But the interior of the building is just so interesting, the way it's decorated.
Yeah, actually, there's a very interesting quote from the New York article that I wanted to share with you here, Asif. Lumen Industries sleek Asif. Oh, Lumen's sleek office looked like a cross between a mid-century library and an Apple store. And there was a piquant, spicy irony in a tech giant producing a show that lampoons corporate surveillance. I thought that was, as you look at for layers upon layers, I thought that's pretty rich.
Yes. Yeah, because there's cameras. Yeah, very interesting. And by the way, I think does every New Yorker article have to have the word piquant in it? It seems this is like...
I don't know, but I get hungry every time I see it. I welcome
writing at the highest level here. Okay. I really liked the production design in the end. I wasn't sure about it. And I think, like you said, Ali, the twists and turns of the corridors, it's all on purpose. The board of directors speaks through a little speaker, which looks like Charlie's Angels speaker that, Charlie would talk through.
Sure, but most of the time they're not speaking.
Right, they're just listening. I know.
You just hear them breathing on the other end, which is a comment on how, I just think of like these auditions that actors go for, and that's when you see it right in front of you. They're just like on their laptop looking up something else, but you have like prepared. It's a callback. Oh, the production company's going to be there. They're returning emails while you're in the room across from them. And they're like, okay, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Right, exactly. Nobody cares. Yeah.
And it feels like that. Like this is you're in front of people who really don't care. We're not going to talk. We've got other stuff to do. You talk, and then,
Interestingly, even for the computers, they took old computers and kind of made them so they could work and that the workers in the show could actually do the task. It's a very menial task, which I won't get into, but probably there's some hidden meaning to what they're doing in the task. And it's all like DOS based, right? There's no Windows or Apple or anything like that. But interestingly, the computers don't have an escape key on them. They purposely took that off the keyboard to kind of be a metaphor for you cannot escape this corporate life. I mean, this is the level of detail in this show.
You cannot escape the hell of this world. Yeah.
So let's just talk about a couple other things about the show, Ali, just in the last few minutes of this section. The mundane office life. They get these silly little gifts for completing their work, like a caricature of themselves. And then if they do a really good job, they get like a melon party where they get like a cart that comes out with a whole bunch of melon. And Ali must have been really excited. In one of the last episodes of the first season, they get an egg bar with deviled eggs and a whole bunch of eggs.
Egg salad.
Ali, of course, this is the last aside, I promise, of this section. Ali is very in tune with eggs because on the children's TV show Odd Squad,
well, also because they're delicious, but yes, because of the Odd Squad, yes.
He played a character who just loved eggs.
While there was a character who delivered pizza, as one does, as one has done, I delivered egg salad sandwiches. And my business was booming, as it turned out.
And I must admit, kids, like, they often know Ali from that. And when my daughters tell other kids that their uncle is Delivery Doug, the kids get very excited. They actually don't believe my kids when they tell them that. But anyway.
That's funny. All the work got done, but the egg guy. The egg guy with his eggmobile. But it was a great character. What are you going to do?
We didn't really talk about the other cast members of the show. They're all superbly cast. I don't know what you think, Ali. It's great.
Oh, my God. There were times, despite the drinking and the not remembering things, there were times where I had to pause it and go look up people. because the people you know are phenomenal. John Turturro, Christopher Walken, Adam Scott. And then, there's Patricia Arquette. I didn't even recognize.
Yeah, I didn't recognize her either. She is so good in this.
Oh my God. It's fantastic. But I really was so taken aback because this type of acting requires some real reeling it in. Your subtle facial reactions, your subtle increase in tone. I mean, Patricia Arquette does lose her mind at one point, but just small little things, mainly because of this corporate environment, because everybody's trying to be very even keeled. You're not trying to get too excited about anything. And you're trying to also be a little bit phony. So you're acting like you're acting in some cases, I found this show I can't say enough about the casting. Really, really something.
It's great. I want to call out Tremel Tillman, who plays Milchek, the supervisor.
Yeah, who I didn't know. Did you know him? He plays Milchek? Yeah.
I didn't know him before, and he looks familiar, so I may have seen him in a few things. He hasn't been I looked up his Wikipedia and IMDb. He hasn't been in too much stuff. This is his first main role, but he is so good as Milchek. He plays a big role in the first episode of the second season, and he is just a great actor. And you're right, it's the subtlety. You have to get people in the cast who are able to portray these very subtle emotions. Nothing is big and huge in this.
No.
Sometimes in the outy world, but when they're in the office, it has to be all very subtle. Speaking of subtle, I loved, this is a spoiler as well, there's a relationship between John Turturro's character and Christopher Walken's character. So subtle, so gentle. I mean, a great romance. So it is so well done. Again, like two older men having a relationship on a show, just really good. And of course, I won't even ruin it for Ali, who hasn't seen the last episode of the first season, about what happens with their relationship towards the end of the first season. So I won't ruin that. I guess we're saying this. I cannot recommend this show more highly. It's probably the most looked forward to show. That's not a real sentence, is it?
Forward looking to show?
It was a show I was looking forward to the most in 2025. I have seen the first episode of the second season. I will not spoil it for everybody. I finished it minutes before we recorded this podcast. It is great. It takes place almost immediately after the events of the last episode of the first season, and it begins to explain things. But then the more you think about this show, and I'm not trying to spoil anything for the second season, but you think about who would do this? Why would people want to do this? What would be the other reasons that you'd want to do this? And what are the implications of having the severance? And the more you think about it, and they get into this in the last episodes of the first season, but the more you think about it, the more disturbing it is. A couple interesting things from the interview with Ben Stiller, as well as one I saw on the cast on YouTube. The interviewer on the YouTube interview asked the whole cast, is there anybody who you think only lives on the outside world, but could perhaps also work during the day at Lumen Industries? And the cast didn't say anything. And Dan Erickson was there, and he didn't say anything either. So it's very interesting. So that may be something that may come up later. The other thing in the Ben Stiller interview is Ben Stiller said that they've mapped out the whole series. They know what happens in the series, but he's not going to say how many seasons they're going to do. Which is amazing, because a lot of shows will be like, yeah, we're going to do 5 seasons, that's it. We're going to do 4 seasons, that's it. But he doesn't want to do that, because when the ending comes, the ending will come. So he seems to imply there's going to be more than this season, the second season. But when it ends, it ends. And I think that's a very smart way of doing things, because it keeps the suspense up, right? Because if there's 5 seasons, well, then nothing's going to be resolved in season 3 and 4, but it could end at any time. I think that's really exciting.
Sure. I like that too. We both love the show. In summary, we both speak very highly of it. I obviously need to finish that first season and hit the ground, but I'm so excited to rewatch, because also me not so smart, and to rewatch also I understand things a little bit better. And I'm also, slight aside but related, I am teaching an acting class this semester. Acting for the Camera is what it's called. And I'm super dialed in right now. When I'm listening to podcasts on the drive to the university, it's a 3-hour drive. I'm listening to podcasts about acting. I'm really immersing myself in acting and listening to people talk about the craft. And to watch this show, it feels like top to bottom, it is masters of their craft at work. And if you don't believe us, Adam Scott received his first ever Emmy nomination for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama Series for this show. Well deserved. So we're talking about memory today, and as I illustrated in the first section, I have one, and she not so good. There's some issues with my memory. The only thing with me is that my issues with my memory have always been this case. It's unfortunate. I have poor retention, and also I don't remember things to begin with. So that combination makes for a person who needs to like really take notes, and sometimes this is what I like. I was listening to Stephen Colbert talk in an interview with Mike Birbiglia about meeting people who he loves, meeting people who are super interesting, and they will say things to him, and then he walks away and he goes, I don't remember anything. And he, by his own admission, has a fantastic memory. He says, I can remember a phone number somebody gave me from 3 years ago. I have a really great memory. In fact, people mistake that for intelligence. I don't have the same ability. He goes, for example, my wife can understand concepts, high level, low level. I don't have that. What I have is an incredible memory. But hearing him say that, like when he got the Colbert Show, David Letterman called him. David had always been a fan of his. And he said, I was scrambling to get a pen because I was like, I am going to forget everything. And it gave me some comfort because that is exactly who I am. And so you will often see me when I go for lunch with somebody, when I'm talking to somebody, my phone is out, not because I'm, if anybody walked by, they'd be like, well, Ali Hassan's pretty rude. Somebody's talking to him and he's on his phone. I am writing down things that person is telling me. Oh, that's an interesting book. I'm 100% going to forget that. Let me just type this in. Oh, that is a very interesting podcast. And this phenomenon, this study from Yale that talks about the anxious generation of children and blah, blah. I got to take this. And as I'm studying acting more in depth than I ever have, you're only a better actor the more you understand about human behavior and science and psychology and sociology. So I'm all over it. I don't feel as insecure as I once did about my memory, hearing other people talk about theirs, but I definitely don't have a great memory. So that's kind of where we're coming from. It's obviously a great link with Severance, but let's talk about that. I have a real fascination with not just memory and bad memory, but this concept of memory where somebody goes, oh, no, I remember. And it's a funny thing to say because memory is a notoriously bad source of information.
Exactly. Good. Yeah, I want to talk about that for sure.
So yeah, let's talk about memory. Are there different types of memory? Let's talk about memory loss and all these errors. And finally, we should really talk about, leave me and our listeners with tricks and tips and techniques. I hope you have a list of them of how to increase your memory, improve your memory.
Yeah. So one of the misconceptions people have with memory is they think it's like a filing cabinet, right? Like you put things in, then you just take them out when you're ready. But that's not what it is. It's very complicated. And there's conscious memory, there's unconscious memory. I'll talk about the different types to kind of give you a bit more information about that. But I'm trying to make this simple. What neuroscientists have shown is that each time we remember something, we reconstruct the event, reassembling it from traces of different memories throughout the brain. And just by me saying that, it makes sense that it's fallible, right? It's not perfect. And I think you have illustrated that in many ways, your Severance example as being one, but
I'll never stop illustrating it.
That's right. So we can think about there's types of memory and there's different kind of modes of memory. The modes of memory you can think about like how they're related to storage of memory. So there's something called working memory, and working memory is actually not very well understood. And there was a theory that working memory is something where you could have up to 7 items in your working memory. Okay. And so if you're trying to work on a problem, and the best example is a phone number. Okay. So Ali, I'm going to give you my phone number when I was growing up as a kid. It was 825-2207. You probably never called that, but that's 7 numbers, right? And that's why people say phone numbers were 7 digits back in the day. Now, very often you have to put an area code in, which makes it more complicated. And nowadays, just put in your phone and then you just press a button. So we don't really have to memorize phone numbers like we did.
Right, which I imagine is having an effect on our memories as we commit less things to memory than we used to, right? I used to know 11 phone numbers minimum by heart, and I don't anymore. I don't.
I bet you could, but then, and this is an example of what's called long-term memory. If I ask you to give the phone number of your best friend from childhood, you could probably give it to me right now, right?
Yes, I could.
Okay, but don't
Yes,
do
I
it
could.
because someone's going to dial it, and of course somebody else probably
Yes,
lives
his
in
mother
the-
still lives there. I was about to say that's what my pause was about. I think Zach Moose's mom and dad still live at the same
Yeah.
house with the same number. So, and it was also the easiest number ever imaginable.
So working memory is kind of like, okay, you're giving it, say, that series of numbers. You got to think about those right now. Then you have what's called a short-term memory, where people have told you information. So Ali just told me the information about Severance, how he didn't end up watching the show. You've given me that information and I'm remembering it right now, right? You just told me it a few minutes ago. So that is in our short-term memory, which is what's in the hippocampus, okay? And I'm simplifying this a lot. And so that's things that you've learned relatively recently, right? You're creating kind of connections or transmissions between these areas, okay?
Short-term memory and long-term memory.
Yeah, so you connect.
That's what you're talking about.
Sorry, let me say it differently. You're connecting transmission in the hippocampus between neurons there, and that's kind of creating the short-term memory. Okay, but then eventually you want to consolidate things into your long-term memory, and your hippocampus is an area in your temporal lobe beneath your temples, and it's called hippocampus because it kind of curls in and looks like a seahorse. And a seahorse, the Latin name or Greek name or whatever, hippocampus. So that's it kind of looks like a seahorse. So that's why they call it that. That's where this short-term memory resides, right? But when you put something into long-term memory, okay, and I'll talk a bit more about this, how you do this, how you consolidate memory in a few minutes. That's kind of dispersed throughout all different areas of your brain, okay? And once it's there, it's usually locked in there, okay? So an example might be the phone number of your friend when you were growing up, right? That is locked in there. That's not leaving anytime soon, your address when you were growing up, right? That's locked in. Very different location.
Or the lyrics
to songs.
The lyrics to Bruce Springsteen's Thunder Road or Ghetto Boys, my mind's playing tricks on me. That is one of the most fascinating things about memory.
Perfect. Okay, so this gets me. So then there's different. So we have short-term and long-term memory, but there's different types of short-term and long-term memory. Okay, So one of these categories is called declarative memory. Okay, and there's two types of declarative memory. So there's lots of types and subtypes. So one of them is semantic memory, which is learned facts and knowledge, right? So things that you've learned in the past, you learned about, what happened during the War of 1812, etc. So those are facts, the capital of certain countries and things like that, right? That is just knowledge that you have. But then there's what's called episodic memory. And episodic memory is your experiences and things that have happened in your life. So remembering the last holiday you took, remembering what it was like for your 18th birthday and what you did, right?
Right. And this is subject to, versus semantic, episodic memory would be subject to great variances.
Yes, and we'll talk about that as well.
A variety of things, yeah.
There's also non-declarative memory, which occurs in various areas of the brain. We don't have to get into, but a good example of this is procedural memory, okay? And the classic example is riding a bike, right? When you get on a bike, will just start riding the bike. You don't have to go back and think about, okay, well, how do you do that? Okay, that's right. And then you start doing it. So when you think about actions that you've learned over time, and riding a bike is the best example because it's not even like reading a piece of music and playing it. This is so ingrained, you just do it, right? So that's procedural memory. So these are just different types of memory. They all have to start in short-term memory and be encoded and go into long-term memory. But like I was saying, with the short-term memory, what's happening is neurons that don't really talk to each other are now talking to each other. And that's how you're creating the short-term memory.
You were going to say something about consolidating memory?
Yeah. So let's say, give the example of a birthday party, right? Your 18th birthday party. There is a lot of information which occurred at the birthday party. There's auditory memories, visual, spatial, where it occurred. And so what happens is the hippocampus, this area underneath your temples, initially has that, and then it has to distribute this memory to different areas. The areas that control our hearing and the areas that are responsible for vision and spatial awareness. And then so now you're able to store those memories long term. And eventually you don't even need to use the hippocampus anymore. You could just go directly to those memories. And so that's essentially what long-term memory is. And so you need to eventually consolidate this memory. But if we could take a step back, one of the issues that happens, because you want to talk about memory loss, so you're mentioning that Stephen Colbert has a hard time remembering certain things, right? That's what he was saying?
Yeah, somehow it's particularly connected to important people in
Right.
his life. So he talked about meeting Mike Nichols. Mike Nichols, very famous comedian, part of this
Director.
legendary duo Nichols and May, then became a director. Absolutely. So Meryl Streep at an award show is like, "Oh, Stephen, Mike wants to meet you." And Stephen Colbert looks, it's Mike Nichols. He goes, "All I remember is hello, Stephen," and nothing after that. Literally nothing.
Okay.
And so if his wife was like, "What did Mike Nichols say to you?" He'd be like, "I really don't have any memory at all." So that was gone. Same thing when Letterman called him and said, "You got the show. Here's some of the things you should be concerned." And he's like, "Oh my God, I'm going to forget." He just knows the more important the person, the more important the thing, it's just going to all be a blur. But seemingly unimportant things stick with him.
Okay, so this is really good. So there's a couple things here. In a second, we'll talk about amnesia, which is a real thing that happens to people, not just getting like bonked on the head like, they do in a sitcom. But you raise a really good point, which I've talked about on the podcast before. The idea of you need to be attending to something in order to put it into your short-term memory. Okay? So say, Ali, I'm thinking about, oh my gosh, it's January, am I going to go on vacation this year? What am I going to do? And you're in the middle of talking to me during the podcast. I'm not attending to what you're saying. And so because of that, it's not going to get stored in your short-term memory. So usually when people complain to me about memory problems, it's not actually memory problems. It's attending to what's going on. It's like, I told my kid to take out the garbage, and then they said they don't remember me telling them when they did. That's because they were on their phone. So it could be distraction. It could be poor attention, like ADHD. It could be something like anxiety. And my guess is that's what is going on with Colbert. He's meeting one of the most famous and prolific directors of the 20th century. There's a million things going through his mind. And the last thing you're going to do is concentrate on exactly the info that's coming in. Depression is another one. If all you're thinking about is how miserable your life is and how sad you are, you're not going to attend when people are talking to you. So you need to do this. So I would say the majority of patients I see, especially in kids and teenagers, is because they're not attending to what's going on. They're not putting it into their short-term memory.
That's very interesting. I'm typically good with names.
Mm-hmm. I'm horrible with that.
Less good than I was. But I attribute it to this concept of attending, which I've never really heard vocalized like this. But when somebody says, "Hi, my name is John," I either repeat it back to them, "Hey, John, how's it going?" and add a little thing in my mind. Okay, this person's name is John. I just know that it feels good when somebody hears their name. I know it feels good to make that connection with somebody and like know the very basic thing, their name. So when friends of mine are like, "How do you remember people's names?" There is a little bit of an effort there. I'm attending. I'm taking note of that. I find a name is an important thing. I know how I feel when somebody goes, "What's his name from?" Oh my God, one of my favorite, Craig Robinson. Okay. Craig Robinson from The Office, from many different things. I met that dude at a Just for Laughs. He goes, "What's your name?" I said, "It's Ali Hassan." An hour later, he's leaving a show. He goes, "See you later, Ali." And I just, especially a guy who he has no reason to remember that. You just know what that makes you feel like when somebody remembers your name. Then they also make assumptions about you that may or may not be true. He was a really good guy. He actually could be a complete piece of trash.
Okay, I do want to talk about that. That's really important as well. Let's just talk about amnesia, then I'll get into some of those things you talk about how imperfect our memory is. So amnesia, you can get different kinds of amnesia. So you get a head injury, right? And we're talking about serious head injuries, like I said, but a serious enough concussion that will knock you unconscious, serious enough that can cause amnesia. But right, that when you've seen this, there's something called Ribot's Law. I don't know if it's Ribot or Ribot's Law, that the more remote memories are intact when you have amnesia, okay? And the more recent memories are often the ones that are impaired. Now you know why. Because someone's in a car accident, they're like, "I can't remember the accident, I can't remember everything for 24 hours before that, but everything else before that I have a good memory of." That's because that info was still in your short-term memory, in your hippocampus. It didn't get a chance to be stored and consolidated into long-term memory. Because of that, you lost that short-term memory because your body was still in the process of making those connections to consolidate. It never got a chance to do it. So that's what we call retrograde amnesia. You can't remember things in the past. But there's also something called anterograde amnesia, which is what happened in the movie Memento, where you can't create new memories. So you don't have the ability to even, that's usually an injury to the hippocampus, right? On both sides of the brain. So you can't create new memories. You need to put them in short term and then put them in long term, but you can never do that. So you constantly have to relearn things. Again, everything before that injury will be intact, but everything afterwards, you cannot create new memories. It's very unusual for that to happen, but it can.
That's what I was going to say. I don't imagine that's
very rare.
Right.
I have seen it. I've also seen, we've talked about patients who have functional neurologic disorders, so it's often stress-induced or whatever. I've seen patients who've had anterograde amnesia that's kind of psychogenic or psychologic. That's briefly about how amnesia works.
I find myself very sort of in the moment. You and I are talking about amnesia and memory, and it's connected to severance. In 6 months from now, I will say to you, did we ever do a podcast episode about memory? And you will immediately be like, yeah, don't you remember severance, memory? And I'm like, oh yeah, that's happened numerous times with us, where I've actually suggested maybe we can do this episode. And you're like, well, we've already done that. So what does that account for?
Okay.
I'm very much in the moment. I feel like I'm attending. I feel like I'm present. But as time goes by, I just sort of let certain things go to the garbage, the trash bin of my brain, and I let new stuff kind of come in.
So interesting. So we don't know why. So you may have a hard time storing some things into long-term memory. It stays in your short-term and then it kind of just goes away. Why we remember certain things versus other things, I think that just has to do with inherent strengths that people have and things that they find important. Clearly, you don't find the podcast important. I'm just joking. But in fact, the same thing happened to me. I had to search through our Google Docs to see if we ever had a doc on memory because I thought we did one, but we never did. We talked about Alzheimer's. So I did the same thing. But there's also this concept, like I said, about how imperfect our memory is. And this comes up a lot in like court cases and people recounting memories for court cases. And I'll link to a very interesting article. So it's in a scientific article, but it's interviewing psychologists who know a lot about how memory works and how you have to keep in mind all these imperfections in our memory when we're talking about things like court cases, because the legal system wants to say that memory is pretty good. If you're confident in your memory, that's even better. People who are confident are more accurate. That's actually not true. And if it's a very intense situation, okay, so for example, like, oh, I witnessed a car accident or somebody attacked me, you have the adrenaline, it's such a strong emotional, you'll remember that more. And of course, there is evidence for that, because sometimes when you have a very intense emotional memory, you remember those incidents more clearly, right? When someone yelled at you or cut you off in traffic, your heart rate was up. And then because you end up using different systems, our more emotional systems to remember that. But it doesn't mean that everything you recall in that is correct. And so there's a lot of kind of memory bias that they talk about where we use our existing body of knowledge to fill in the gaps of what happened. And of course, that can be subject to errors. One person, this guy named Nesser, he likened memory retrieval to paleontology. So he's like, out of a few bone chips, we can remember the entire dinosaur. Right? Like you're filling in these blanks, and there's lots of things that contribute to this misinformation. So one of them is your previous experiences. You could even suggest things. So one example, they had in a study, they had these participants watch a car accident, and then they said, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? Or they said, how fast were they going when they hit each other? And you reported greater speeds when you use the word smashed.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So you can suggest this as another example. Even in highly trained individuals, they had military personnel who were enrolled in a survival school. So how to handle a stressful interrogation if you become a prisoner of war, right? So they actually do a mock interrogation, and they did 500 active military personnel who had to get this mock interrogation. Then afterwards, and the person was right in front of them, it wasn't a dark room. They interrogated them for 30 to 40 minutes. And then afterwards, they asked these military personnel, please identify the person from a series of pictures who interrogated you. And a third of them were incorrect. No, and a third of them were correct. So 2/3 misidentified the person who just interrogated them for 34 minutes.
Even though it's an interrogation and your blood pressure should be up, your anxiety should be high, you should.
And you're paying attention to what's going on.
Yeah.
And these are trained personnel, and they also know it's a fake situation. This isn't a real interrogation. They couldn't do it. So even something like September the 11th, everybody remembers where they were on September 11th. But in one study, a very interesting study, it was done in real time. They asked to remember where they first heard about the attacks, and then they were asked to recall the episode a week later, and then 1 year later, then 3 years later. Okay? The only question was when you first heard about September the 11th attacks. And 37% of people had the details change after 1 year and 43% after 3 years. The details of when they heard about it.
So the more things that happen in your life inform your way of thinking and influence your way of thinking, and that shifts your everything backwards. That's insane. And I think it's also interesting sometimes to view people who, some people view the world as being sort of against them, right? They're the victim of something, and how they might interpret an incident versus somebody who doesn't look at the world that way can be wildly different in the moment because the lens through which you see things is so different. It's crazy.
Similar to that, there's a whole racial bias to this, and it's not necessarily people being overtly racist, but we're more familiar often with people of our own ethnic background, we'll say, right? In terms of their facial appearance. So now when you have to recall and say it's a police lineup, right? And now everybody is a different racial background than you're not going to be as good at identifying them. And then, so then your brain will start to fill in the blanks, right? So part of it is the familiarity as well. So all this to say, there is a lot of errors that we make with regards to memory because of this. So not just with the amnesia and you've had damage to your brain, but just in your regular recall of things. And even if you're confident, even if it was an emotional situation, you can still be wrong.
Okay, with all this knowledge that you have bestowed upon us, and not all of it is great news, how do we strengthen our memories? How do we improve our memories? And you can only do it going forward. Obviously, you can't go back and improve things from the past. So what's the next thing?
Yeah, that's right. Because that's really important, Ali. You can't go back and create new memories, right? That's it. Like, you can't put them into long-term memory if you haven't already done that, right? So that's really important. Okay, so some of the stuff is stuff that we already know. Things that overall increase your health. So if you have high blood pressure, and a lot of this is taken from how to prevent Alzheimer's. So I'm kind of combining prevention for Alzheimer's, which would be the most extreme memory problems, versus just improving your memory overall. Is that okay, Ollie? Do I have your permission?
Okay.
So we know that people with high blood pressure normalize their blood pressure. That can help to improve or decrease your risk of Alzheimer's and improve your memory. Physical activity, for sure. Okay. And then doing things that we know that can decrease the risk of heart disease and stroke, which can contribute to eventually having memory issues. So quit smoking, alcohol in moderation, or just stop alcohol completely. And diet, which Ali always wants to talk about, is important. Obviously, sugary, processed foods, things that are going to increase your risk of diabetes, you want to kind of limit those things. But there is some evidence, especially in the Alzheimer's literature, about the Mediterranean diet, about how that can be preventative. So just to recap, Mediterranean diet, you want a diet rich in fruits, vegetables, legumes, grains, fish, right? And olive oil as your primary cooking oil. And of course, that also helps because it helps with things like diabetes, cholesterol, heart disease as well. Sleep, obviously important. That is becoming more and more established as the evidence is coming out. There's this whole idea of this glymphatic system, which kind of resets your brain. This isn't, crazy science. This is cutting edge evidence-based stuff. So sleep is very important. 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night for every adult. That you have to do that. And I think people are paying more and more attention to this. Obviously, the idea of keeping yourself cognitively active, and I think that's a worry when people say retire or then their spouse passed away, you're doing less things. You want to always be trying new things. So whether it's travel, learning new languages, using, what's that thing that they use?
Duolingo,
trying a musical instrument. There's no reason if you're in your 50s, 60s, 70s, you shouldn't start that, take an art class, cooking classes, puzzles, board games, Sudokus, anything to keep your brain active is important. And I think there's more and more evidence for that as time goes on. And then one of the last things to remember is keeping up a good network of social relationships, right? The same way we talked about in previous episodes, like, dementia increases in people who have hearing problems, vision problems, because I think that's because of isolation. You're just becoming more and more isolated, less interaction. So it's not just cognitive interaction, it's social interaction. And of course, things like reducing your stress. There's more and more evidence for mindfulness, right? To help with, because mindfulness is really just keeping you in the moment, right? As much as I've poo-pooed mindfulness when people talk to me about it, and even maybe Ali and I have talked about it offline, the idea is you're going to be in the moment. And if I'm in the moment and actually attending to you, Ali, right now as we're talking, I will be able to store that into my short-term memory and then to my long-term memory. It just makes sense, right? I think it's really important to also keep that in mind as well.
Sure. I think about my father's life and my father who had done things to fail almost every organ in his body. His brain still strong right till the bitter end. And that was a man who read the Gazette, Montreal Gazette every morning, and the Globe and Mail, 2 newspapers every morning, read voraciously, was constantly, he was an English teacher, loved reading. That was a passion of his. And very social, loved hanging with his friends more than he loved hanging with his own family. I'm fine with it. We don't need to therapy me. No, I'm fine. But yeah, no, he loved hanging with his buddies. And I think as much as my mother would have hated that and his children would have questioned that, yeah, I think it was good for his overall mental health.
Okay, well, that's our episode for today. Let us know what you guys thought about it. Have you guys seen Severance? Are you interested in the show? Maybe even more so. Ali, I did get some feedback from someone I met the other day who said they really like not just our banter, but when we expose them to things that they haven't, like whether it's TV shows, movies, books, etc., that they hadn't really heard about. So hopefully some people will check out Severance. And of course, memory. There's lots of other things to talk about with memory. We could do a deep dive into amnesia and some of the case reports of amnesia. And of course, there's probably more things to talk about with regards to dementia and prevention of that as well.
I do want to issue an apology that may or may not be necessary, but I'll tell you, I have moved from where I used to record in my home to my home office. We are recording on a morning where it's garbage day in my neighborhood, and I have literally heard, so we have 2 different garbage trucks. One comes for the green, one comes for the black. So I have seen during this podcast, green come on our side, green come on the other side of the street, black come on our side, black. And in this 1 hour, all 4 iterations have happened. And so I don't know if listeners can hear that, if you can hear that.
Let us know. I couldn't hear it, but I think this proves that Ali is probably not going to remember the recording of this episode because he was so distracted by the garbage trucks and he's not attending. So next week he'll be like, we should do Severance in memory.
Oh, yes. True enough. Well, I'll be honest. I don't think I was super distracted, but it was adding to a little bit of like the comedy of how classic. Of course, all 4 have to come during this time. So I was kind of looking over and I was like, classic. That's what I was doing. I heard most of what you said.
Very nice.
What did we talk about again today?
Let us know what you guys thought about the episode. drvcomedian@gmail.com, Dr. V Comedian on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky. We are everywhere. We'll also be having some clips that hopefully, if we figure out how to use social media properly, will show up on Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts and blah, blah, blah. TikTok is about to be banned in America, so probably not TikTok. Anyway, reach out to us and let us know.
And TikTok banned you before you banned it right?
Exactly. Now this is my long-term revenge on TikTok. Ali, what do you got going on for end of January, February?
I am heading to Maple Ridge, BC, Edmonton, Alberta. Tickets almost sold out for 4 shows. We may be adding a 5th show. Nelson, BC, my favorite city in the west part of this country. or it was the one time I went. And then, yeah, some other shows. I'm opening for Maz Jobrani in Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto, and we'll be in Ottawa at the Schenkman Center for a Laugh Out Loud CBC recording.
Yeah, lots of my friends are saying, yeah, what's going on? You're going to that, I'm going to get tickets. Lots of interest in those Ottawa shows, Ali, for you.
And you've said, no, not interested. You're going to be away.
I am not going at all. I've had enough. No, I'm going to be out of town when Ali's here. I'm going to be doing some work at Boston Children's Hospital, associated with the good old Harvard University. That's going to be in February. So we may still record from there. I might do a remote recording and talk to Ali about what I'm learning there, but we'll figure that out later.
It's good. Finally, this sabbatical of yours is more than just taking your kids to volleyball and soccer. You know what I mean?
Exactly. I'm doing more. Come on, man. Don't let people hear that. Anyway, but one more thing before we go, just remember that although I'm a doctor, I'm not your doctor. Medical issues we talk about are for your interest and information only, and they're not medical advice. Please consult your medical professionals for actual medical advice. Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.